Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is Early American Literature. In this lecture, I want to discuss a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson, of course, written by Mary Rowlandson, first published in 1682, and an early and quite popular example of this Native American captivity genre, which I will discuss a bit later. But in addition to just thinking about how this text helps us understand these depictions of Native Americans and these interactions between these settlers and Native Americans, I think this is an interesting genre piece as well. But I also think it affords us an opportunity to understand just what Puritan life was like in the mid 17th century, nearing the end of the 17th century, but also just how religion in particular informed the lives of these Puritan settlers. And I think a figure like Mary Rowlandson is an excellent example and an appropriate example of just, again, how religion created this sense of what one's identity is and a sense of what one's purpose is. But let's spend a few minutes talking about the different genres that this narrative situates itself in. And the first, just broadly speaking, is the captivity narrative genre. And in the United States, in American literature, this is often Native Americans who are the captors, and they are capturing or they are absconding with often these white settler figures. So a little bit about just the captivity narrative as a genre. Although most captivity narratives are based on true events, there is an obvious play between fact and fiction, and this is something we've discussed already this semester. We have spoken, for example, about the degree to which ideologies and agendas mediate the author and the text, but also the reader. And here are just some notable characteristics of the captivity narrative genre. It's often a situation where a captor the author portrays is unmistakably evil, which means often in these kinds of narratives, those doing the absconding, the captors themselves, are often described by the captive, the survivor, as unmistakably evil. Just imagine they are these mustache-twirling villains. But one of the things I want you to think about with Rawlinson as well are her descriptions, and is her overall characterization of Native Americans one that fits with this genre expectation? Are there moments of sympathy and nuance that maybe we haven't seen to this point? There's also often a suffering victim who, in these kinds of captivity narratives, is often a female. Furthermore, there's this romantic or sexual encounter between the captive and the captor, or the captive and this alien culture. Now, what's notable about Mary Rowlandson's text is this frankly doesn't happen. And near the end, I may speak about why, and I cannot say whether it did or didn't, but I can certainly say a bit about why, whether it did or not, why she would not include it in this narrative. We also often see a heroic rescue of the captive by this male hero. Again, doesn't necessarily happen here. You might even argue the climax of this narrative is a bit underwhelming when you think about some examples of the genre, and I'll mention those in just a minute. But there's also just these clear propagandistic elements, which is to say, the author of these texts, again, this is something we've mentioned already this semester. It's difficult to know if everything they communicate is true, if there may be, because all of this is written after the events in question, in Rawlinson's case, approximately 7 years after. But I think Rawlinson in particular, her religious propaganda is something you see quite often in this narrative. Now, I mentioned a moment ago some examples. There are certainly contemporary examples of the captivity narrative. Think about, for example, the Taken film franchise. If you are familiar with and if you like those are to some degree captivity narratives. Maybe you could argue the Saw franchise or some early entries feel a bit like captivity narratives. Every Secret Thing by Patty Hearst. If you're unfamiliar with who she is, you should definitely do a bit of research, but that's also part of this captivity narrative genre, and even many westerns, such as the 1956 John Wayne film The Searchers. The Searchers, actually, if you watch it, it's a good movie, but it actually has a lot of the characteristics of what we see in Rawlinson's narrative. Now, the second narrative type that Mary Rawlinson's captivity narrative fits neatly into is something called the Jeremiad. And I'll talk about this for just a minute because the Jeremiad is this moralistic genre that often bemoans the state of affairs in a particular society. Frederick Douglass, who we will read later this semester, used the Jeremiad in public speaking events in the early and mid 19th century to decry the horrors of slavery. In Rawlinson's hands, the Jeremiad operates to critique Native Americans for the brutality of King Philip's War. However, it also operates to challenge Christian readers, who at the time were predominantly Puritans, to evaluate their faith and commitment to God. Again, this is something we see Rawlinson returning to often. This question, well, am I someone who God has favored, and what can I do to ensure that I'm part of the elect? Now, I also want to say a little something about Rawlinson's religion and what I mentioned earlier as this potential religious propaganda. Because Puritanism, and what I am about to say is perhaps to some degree an oversimplification. There's far more anyone could say about Puritanism, but what I want to say, just to perhaps establish some boundaries, is to emphasize how heavily influenced Puritans were by Calvinism. And what you see often in this narrative, again, is this sense that there are those who are part of the elect and those who are not, which is to say, there are those who will receive salvation, who God has predetermined to award salvation to, and those who will receive damnation. And it really seems to suggest there's perhaps nothing any individual can do. You are either part of the elect or you're not. But what we see in a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rawlinson is this pursuit to know, am I part of the elect? Just searching for some kind of confirmation, which is why from time to time you often hear her speak so fondly of just the trials, right? Wanting to be tested as a way of confirming her faith and as a way of confirming her status as one of the elect. This is part, again, of this religious propaganda that seems to just permeate this text. But why don't we now go ahead and dive into the text? And again, broadly speaking, there are two main points of interest that I want to consider: how Rawlinson deploys references to the Bible, what this text can teach us about religion for a figure like Rawlinson, how it informs her life, and also just how this text treats Native Americans. But maybe before even thinking about the text, it might be productive just to look at the title, because titles can be suggestive. For example, if you think about a movie like Star Wars, well, that tells you everything you need to know about the movie you are about to watch. It's about war in space, right? So this narrative has a similar sort of function because Rawlinson, at least if we are reading the title closely, does not want to fool or trick her reader into thinking that her captivity ends in death. The title, again, a narrative of the captivity and restoration. So for someone like Rawlinson, she treats both the captivity and the restoration of her captivity as one in the same in this narrative. They seem to exist on equal footing. And again, the restoration is perhaps as important as what she experiences during the captivity. And while this is something that perhaps we might expect from the genre, right? Someone is taken and then they are restored or returned. It is as if Rawlinson does not want us to labor under some delusion that this ends as badly as it could for her. She just gives up the game here with the title. And maybe the question worth asking is, well, why does she do that? Why does she want us to know and understand from the beginning that this will not end as poorly as it could? But let's spend a minute just reading the opening paragraph, because I think the scene she sets, not only does it demonstrate her skill and her talent as a writer, which she has, but I think it also creates a kind of tone that she carries primarily throughout the text. This is on 269. On the 10th of February, 1675, came the Indians with great numbers upon Lancaster. Their first coming was about sunrising. Hearing the noise of some guns, we looked out. Several houses were burning, and the smoke ascending to heaven. There were 5 persons taken in one house, the father and the mother, and a suckling child. They knocked on the head. The other 2 they took and carried away alive. There were 2 others, who, being knocked out of their garrison upon some occasion, were set upon. One was knocked on the head, the other escaped. Another there was, who running along was shot and wounded and fell down. He begged of them his life, promising them money, as they told me, but they would not hearken to him, but knocked him in the head and stripped him naked and split open his bowels. Another, seeing many of the Indians about his barn, ventured and went out, but was quickly shot down. There were 3 others belonging to the same garrison who were killed. The Indians, getting up upon the roof of the barn, had advantage to shoot down upon them over their fortification. Thus, these murderous wretches went on burning and destroying for them. So this is quite horrifying. And just think about this as an opening paragraph. This really begins like a horror film, doesn't it? And there's no sense of stability and then the attack occurs. We just begin with the attack, and it has this destabilizing effect, but it also has this feeling, or it creates this feeling or this impression that this threat is omnipresent. And this is something that I spoke about last week with Mort's relation, how in that text, Native Americans, or at least in the excerpt of that text that I asked you to read, Native Americans feel like this omnipresent threat. They're just lingering and lurking along the periphery, ready to strike. And it's quite clear that Rawlinson wants to create a similar sort of impression. But she also affords us one of the first opportunities to understand her thoughts and feelings about these natives, and it is not good. She deploys a lot of those deplorable stereotypes. For example, I'll read again. Thus these murderous wretches went on, burning and destroying before them. Now, I would argue it's important to put a pin in this moment, that one of her first encounters, or one of the first encounters we have in this text with Native Americans, casts them as these mindless, violent savages. And just to, from here, trace at times the evolution of Rawlinson's thinking about Native Americans, but also the moments when it's not that simple, where this is not necessarily a text where someone outside of this community or outside of this tribe becomes part of it and then learns that they're really human beings and people. If you've ever watched Dances with Wolves, for example, that's part of what happens in these kinds of narratives. It's not that simple with Mary Rowlandson. Now, there are moments when that does happen to her, but she vacillates a bit, which is to say, she is not nearly as consistent as we might expect. There's a lot of contradictions, and her description and characterization of Native Americans seems to change from one section or one remove to the next. But I would also want to just bring to your attention how violent this opening paragraph is. We have a description of someone split open. We have these references to people, for example, small suckling children having their heads bashed. And this is something you'll see again repeatedly throughout the text. Mary Rowlandson is unrelenting in her honest descriptions of what happened. She doesn't seem to indulge in euphemisms at all. This is just pure violence. It was horrifying for her, and she wants us to certainly understand just how horrifying it was. And I think from here, I'll spend a little bit of time just highlighting some moments or passages where she describes and references Native Americans just to get a sense of what we should think about it. And then I'll spend a bit of time near the end discussing how she uses the Bible and religion and, again, some of this religious propaganda. So why don't we start on page 271, and this is the beginning of the first remove or the first movement. So that's what all of these sections mean. She basically divides this text into sections or chapters based on movement. And I'll just read a bit of that first paragraph. Now away we must go with those barbarous creatures, with our bodies wounded and bleeding, and our hearts no less than our bodies. About a mile we went that night, up upon a hill within sight of the town, where they intended to lodge. There was hard by a vacant house, deserted by the English before, for fear of the Indians. I asked them whether I might not lodge in the house that night, to which they answered, What? Will you love Englishmen still? This was the dolefullest night that ever my eyes saw. Oh, the roaring and singing and dancing and yelling of those black creatures in the night, which made the place a lively resemblance of hell. And as miserable was the waste that was there, made of horses, cattle, sheep, swine, calves, lambs, roasting pigs, and fowl, which they had plundered in the town, some roasting, some lying and burning, and some boiling to feed our merciless enemies, who were joyful enough, though we were disconsolate. So I think I'll stop there. Again, the sentence that begins this section, they are, quote, barbarous creatures, and she offers a detailed description of, from her perspective, just how barbarous they are. They seem wasteful. Notice the details about how they plunder and then just seem to waste their plunder. But even this sense that they are black creatures, and their presence, in addition to this dancing and yelling, created this resemblance for Rowlandson of hell. And I think what she's trying to suggest here is quite simple. She's likening these Native Americans to these devils or demons that you might find in a rather conventional description of hell. Now, from here, and this is maybe one of the moments, again, where you might have been a bit surprised by how Rowlandson writes about these native figures, because this is not a consistently negative depiction. This is on pages 274 and 275, and this is in reference to her receiving permission to read the Bible. And I'll start reading at the bottom of the page. I cannot but take notice of the wonderful mercy of God to me in those afflictions in sending me a Bible. One of the Indians that came from the Medfield fight had brought some plunder, came to me, and asked me if I would have a Bible. He had got one in his basket. I was glad of it and asked him whether he thought the Indians would let me read. He answered yes. So I took the Bible, and and in that melancholy time, it came into my mind to read first the 28th chapter of Deuteronomy, which I did, and when I had read it, my dark heart wrought on this matter. And I think I'll just stop here because this is a small moment and a small detail, but I think it's important that not only did this native have a Bible, but he sought Rawlinson out and asked her if she wanted it. Perhaps knowing or understanding that it was a bit of consolation for her. And when she even asked, "Do you think they'll allow me to read it?" Which, even by asking the question, it seems to imply that she thinks it's strange that he would offer it to her. His response is yes. And this is a moment that I would really want all of you to pause and consider. What does it mean that she's allowed to read her Bible, this source of consolation? It's something to amuse her and entertain her. So even though she is a captive, and I don't want anyone to think that I am anything but horrified by the notion that she is kept against her will. But when we think about captivity, we think of perhaps perpetual torture, but that's not really Rawlinson's experience, and I'll talk about it a little more later. But even this simple gesture, this is an interesting moment, and I would encourage all of you to think about what it might suggest, because I think just broadly, it seems to imply that these natives are not as barbarous as she first thought, because they do seem to understand the importance of the Bible to a person like Rawlinson, and they do offer her this consolation. And another potential moment, again, I think this is small, but this happens a few times in the narrative. She's actually allowed to travel a bit. This is on page 281, top of the page. I asked Liberty to go and see him, and here she means her son. Her son, we learn, was about a mile away. They bade me go, and away I went, but quickly lost myself traveling over hills and through swamps, and could not find the way to him, and I cannot but admire at the wonderful power and goodness of God to me, in that, though I was gone from home and met with all sorts of Indians and those I had no knowledge of, and there being no Christian soul near me, yet not one of them offered the least imaginable miscarriage to me. I turned homeward again and met with my master. He showed me the way to my son. So, again, maybe we just need to reconfigure our definition or our understanding of what captivity means in these kinds of narratives, because this seems atypical. She's allowed to move, and she's allowed to see her family, and she loses herself in her initial attempt. She returns back, and her captors, it seems, just give her or offer her correct direction. So again, perhaps this is challenging what we may have expected from this narrative as we entered it, especially thinking of it as a captivity narrative, because again, it's not like captivity narratives are not popular today. We have certain expectations about what it might mean to be a captive and a captor in these kinds of narratives. And I think this is perhaps another moment where Rawlinson's description of her captors and their behavior and the way they treat her is a bit surprising. Now, she also does reference, it's this moment when she references how, quote, not one of them offered the least imaginable miscarriage to me, which implies that there were no sexually inappropriate encounters, which is a euphemistic way of saying she was not raped or sexually assaulted. And I mentioned this earlier that there might be a strategic reason if it happened to not include it because she wants to cast and characterize herself as this long-suffering Christian woman. But I think this is a moment where we should potentially believe her because I think it helps to develop, whether she intended it this way or not, it helps to develop this characterization of Native Americans as not these mindless, brutal savages. They seem to have an understanding of propriety, and again, she doesn't seem to acknowledge it as such because she always just defers to God as her savior. Under no circumstances does at least at this point in the narrative does she acknowledge that, well, sure, I was their captor, but they didn't treat me as poorly as they could. She doesn't seem to often give credit to the natives themselves. She always just defers to God, and God receives credit. And again, I say this and I realize how complicated it sounds because they are, again, her captors. They have imprisoned her against her will. But my point, I suppose, is she could have written so many negative and stereotypically negative things, and at times she certainly does, but at other times perhaps she doesn't even realize how she's actively writing against some of those stereotypes. And certainly one of the more positive characterizations of Native Americans in this text is King Philip, someone we are familiar with. We read the King Philip speech, I believe, either last week or the week before, and he certainly emerges as one of the more positive figures among the natives in Rawlinson's narrative. For example, on page 282, she describes him as, quote, "the best friend that I had of an Indian, both in cold and hunger, and quickly so it proved." And even if we jump ahead a bit to page 289, this positive characterization of Philip continues. This is the 19th remove near the end. "After many weary steps, we came to Wachusett, where he was, and glad I was to see him. He asked me when I washed me. I told him not this month. Then he fetched me some water himself and bid me wash, and gave me the glass to see how I looked, and bid me squaw, give me something to eat. So she gave me a mess of beans and meat, and a little ground nut cake. I was wonderfully revived with this favor showed me. He made them also to be pitied of all those that carried them captives." And of course, that's a reference to Psalms. But my point, I suppose, is just how striking these characterizations of Philip are, because I think what we're ultimately left to conclude, because Rawlinson has these positive encounters with particular Native Americans. If you think about the native earlier in the text who offers her this Bible, figures like King Philip, but she also has these negative encounters as well. She seems to come to what I think is an important conclusion when thinking about how natives are treated in these kinds of early first encounters. They are not this homogeneous group, which is to say, it is wrong to just cast them all as one type of person or one type of thing. She really begins, whether she intends to do this or not, to see them in a far more heterogeneous way, which is to say, she sees a lot of differences among these individuals. And again, whether intended or not, she seems to arrive at this conclusion, again, whether intended or not, that it's not the Native American as this stereotyped homogeneous conglomerate. It's a situation where some of them are good, quite nice, quite hospitable under the circumstances, and some of them are not. And again, I never really know what to think about the intention here because there are so many inconsistencies at times. It's not like the sort of thing you might see in a film like Dances with Wolves, where there's this clear trajectory from the beginning of the story. I understand these brutal savages, they're the worst, yada yada yada, to okay, I've encountered them, I've lived with them, and now I see them as full and complicated, nuanced and subtle individuals, and that's the message, and that's the message, and that's the moral. With Rawlinson, she really does vacillate, which is to say she bounces back and forth. There's nothing, it seems, stable about her description and characterization and even thoughts of Native Americans. It's always in flux, it seems. And I think one of the moments where we perhaps see just the subtlety and the depth in Rawlinson's characterization of Native Americans is on page 292. So I'll start reading around the middle of the page. About that time there came an Indian to me and bid me come to his wigwam at night, and he would give me some pork and ground nuts, which I did. And as I was eating, another Indian said to me, he seemed to be your good friend, but he killed 2 Englishmen at Sudbury, and there lie their clothes behind you. I looked behind me, and there I saw bloody clothes with bullet holes in them. Yet the Lord suffered not this wretch to do me any hurt. Yea, instead of that, he many times refreshed me, 5 or 6 times did he, and his squaw refreshed my feeble carcass. If I went to their wigwam at any time, they would always give me something, and yet they were strangers that I never saw before. So again, there's so much about this moment that feels contradictory. So this native invites her, in effect, into his home. This native feeds her, and he continues to feed her, and he behaves, it seems, in a rather hospitable way. But we learn that he also just recently killed 2 Englishmen, and he seemed to have their clothes as perhaps trophies or trinkets or whatever. And it's just in this one little moment, this perfect encapsulation of how, more often than not, natives are treated in Rawlinson's text. And I still cannot decide whether this is intentional or not, or whether she realized what she did. But she offers this description of them that has the kind of subtlety, nuance, and contradictions that we often celebrate when we think about great literary characters and great figures of literature. Heroes who are complicated, protagonists who certainly do the right thing more often than not, but it's rarely that simple. Even if you wanted to use a contemporary figure like Batman in comic book mythos, he is someone who attempts to do good, he attempts to do the right thing, but he's a criminal and a vigilante as well. And I think, again, we're seeing a similar sort of subtlety here. Rawlinson does not just leave and render Native Americans as these bloody, mindless savages, nor these naive, childlike simpletons. They have the kind of subtlety, depth, and nuance that we all want to see in our favorite literary figures, but I think most importantly, we want to see in descriptions of ourselves. But now I think I want to spend a few minutes just talking about and highlighting a couple of important moments where Rawlinson makes reference to Christianity and religion, and again, maybe thinking through what I earlier described as religious propaganda. There are moments when she likens herself to a figure like Job. This is on page 279, but something that students often say to me, they're both impressed and often annoyed at just how often She deploys a reference to the Bible as a way of contextualizing something that happens to her. And I think this has a couple of different, perhaps, purposes or intents. I think this, of course, works as a way to legitimize this sense of who she is. Again, this good Puritan Christian. She's someone who at any moment can find some reference in the Bible to help contextualize it. I think this speaks to just, quite frankly, how often she read the Bible, how often she studied the Bible, the depths of her biblical education, which is, again, quite impressive and quite fascinating. But I also think it allows her this avenue to speak to and think through some of the things that I said earlier, in particular about how the way for her to understand what happened is to think of it as a trial, this way of God testing her, this way for her to receive a kind of confirmation of her status as the elect or one of the chosen who will receive inevitably salvation after her death. And when thinking through what it means to be either chosen for salvation or chosen for damnation, I think it creates this impression that everything and everyone, at least for a figure like Rawlinson, is part of this larger plan. And we even see her including the Native Americans in this. Go, for example, to page 295. And this is that third remark, or number 3. I can but admire to see the wonderful providence of God in preserving the heathen for further affliction to our poor country. They could go in great numbers over, but the English must stop. God had an overruling hand in all those things. It was thought if their corn were cut down, they would starve and die with hunger, and all their corn that could be found was destroyed, and they, driven from that little they had in store into the woods in the midst of winter. And yet how, to admiration, did the Lord preserve them for his holy ends? And the destruction of many still amongst the English, strangely did the Lord provide for them, that I did not see, all the time I was among them, one man, woman, or child die with hunger. Though many times they would eat that a hog or a dog would hardly touch, yet by that God strengthened them to be a scourge to his people. And again, this is a small moment, and yet this is another moment where they are, according to Rawlinson, Native Americans are a scourge, quote, a scourge to his people. But reread perhaps what I just read, because this sense that even those that threaten Rawlinson's community, her deeply religious Puritan community, for someone like Rawlinson, the only way to explain it, the only way to reckon with it, is to enfold it into this idea or this notion that it is simply all part of God's plan, the good and the bad. And it even speaks to this idea or this notion that if there is an antagonist present, the Native Americans in this case, it creates the conditions for well-meaning, long-suffering Christians like Rawlinson to potentially suffer as a way of showing and presenting their faith and their dedication. And I mentioned earlier how it also has this effect of confirming their status as one of the elect. And I think part of this larger rhetorical message, or what I described earlier as religious propaganda, I think part of how, and that's always a part of the Jeremiad as a genre of writing or speech, is that it is, and even when I use a term like propaganda, I think propaganda often has a negative connotation, but I'm thinking of it more in a Du Boisian sense. If you've read W.E.B. Du Bois, he wrote about how all art should be propaganda. And I say only all of that because I don't necessarily have, or I don't think it's a problem, the way she uses this experience as a tool or as a vehicle for some of this religious propaganda, again, fitting quite nicely within the Jeremiah genre. And we see this, I think, quite clearly on page 300, just the middle of the page. I have seen the extreme vanity of this world. 1 hour I have been in health and wealthy, wanting nothing, but the next hour in sickness and wounds and death, having nothing but sorrow and affliction. And she continues, because I think this moment is important too, the way she yearned for these trials. Before I knew what affliction meant, I was ready sometimes to wish for it. When I lived in prosperity, having the comforts of the world about me, my relations by me, my heart cheerful and taking little care for anything, and yet seeing many whom I preferred before myself under many trials and afflictions and sickness, weakness, poverty, losses, crosses, and cares of the world, I should be sometimes jealous lest I should have my portion of this life. And that scripture would come to my mind, for whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. But now I see the Lord had his time to scourge and chasten me to portion. The portion of some is to have their afflictions by drops, now one drop and then another, but the dregs of the cup, the wine of astonishment, like a sweeping rain that leaveth no food, did the Lord prepare to be my portion. Affliction I wanted, and affliction I had, full measure I thought, pressed down and running over. Yet I see when God calls a person to anything, and through never so many difficulties, yet he is fully able to carry them through and make them see, as say they have been gainers thereby. And I hope I can say in some measure, as David did, it is good for me that I have been afflicted. So here at the end, we see Rawlinson acknowledging how she was perhaps wrong to want these trials, and she was wrong to want this affliction. But even when it happened, even when it occurred, notice what permitted her to survive. And it wasn't her innate strength. It wasn't the, as contradictory as this sounds, the charity of her captors. It was God. And that's when I speak of this text as feeling propagandistic at times, that's what I mean. And again, I'll say it, I don't think that's necessarily a problem. She wants to make this point to her reader at the time, overwhelmingly a Puritan community, that despite what they suffer, God will carry them through. And if there is anything consistent about this narrative, it is certainly that. Even though she likens herself to Job, I can't recall a time like in Job when she doubts God at all. There is this devotion, this singular dedication and devotion to God, and trust in, again, God's plan or God's divine will. So, okay, I don't want to go on too much longer. I always say this, but there's so much more we could say. This is not necessarily the kind of thing many of my students tell me that they would just choose to read if they had their druthers, but many of them who do read it often tell me they enjoyed it, because whether you find all of her references to Christianity a bit cumbersome, she is a remarkably skilled writer, and she knows how to tell a good story. And the way this text intersects with these genres that we still like and value today, I think that's another reason why this is an endlessly entertaining text to read. But it offers, perhaps in ways that we haven't seen this semester, a fuller and more robust, complicated, and nuanced picture of Native Americans. And that is something, again, worth acknowledging. And that is certainly something you could write about for your longer essay, which is something, if you haven't started thinking about it, you should certainly start doing so. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for now. I hope everyone has a lovely day, and I will talk to you next time. This is Colin Cox. Okay.